Nah, it's all right. I don't remember it. Whoa. Hey, everybody. All right. So that's all right. OK. So I'll do my best to be respectful of the time. We're going to have a little bit less time than we thought. And we don't have any slides. Fortunately, this is a talk about really straightforward things that are not abstract at all. So we'll get through it. I think really the only charts and the only really explanatory visualization that I had was some bar charts. Bar charts are boring. So I'll do my best. So we're talking about here this idea that truth is dead. And the way that I started it was with a really funny picture of a philosopher. Because you have to start with this idea that that reality is a construct of your mind. And I know that sounds like I'm joking. And if you've listened to the podcast, it probably seems like I'm joking. However, I'm being totally serious. So let's start with the idea that reality is a construct of your mind. And what that means in a philosophical context is that all of us live in our own subjective reality. Like if you remember freshman philosophy class and your professor came in, probably stood there a little bit pretentiously at the front of the classroom because philosophy, social science. Oh, come on. This is a data science conference. This is a safe space to make fun of social science. OK. Oh, sorry. Sorry, every computational linguist in the room. OK. So, and the professor might have said something like, prove to me that this is real. And everybody scratches their head and gives some examples and tries to do this problem. And of course, you can't really prove that we're all experiencing the same reality because reality is subjective. That's the idea. OK, so if you're with me that far and you're not too tired from lunch to to bear with me with this abstract concept of philosophy. So the reason that this is true, the kind of implication of the fact that all of our realities are subjective is that what's really happening is that when you use your senses, information comes into your senses, light waves come into my eyes, and my audio or my ears capture like audio waves or whatever, and then the model that I experience reality with is constructed in my mind by my brain. Right? And like in a mechanical way, that's really what's going on. So this idea that reality is subjective actually is kind of interesting. And the implication of this, the reason that I'm starting this talk about word vectors with this, is that for you and I to guarantee that we're experiencing the same reality right now, the only way that that's really possible is for both of us to describe it. Right? So we use language, and we assign labels to things. And once we're using language to assign labels to things, we can kind of agree that everything is as well, even if you experience something totally different than me, like if when you look at me, you see like a fiery dragon going, that's not a big deal because how I think of myself in this room and how you think of me in this room, if we describe it in the same way, it doesn't really matter what's going on behind the scenes because our language allows us to construct a reality that we share, right? So in effect, like our language is reality for us as a community. And the implication of that, if you're with me so far, and I see some skeptical faces, but if you're willing to go with me on the fact that the way that we describe our reality is in fact reality, then you're in this space that some philosophers, again, and there's a really philosopher-y looking old man on the slide that goes with this part of the presentation, is that the idea of truth, like what is real, is social consensus, right? So because we can only describe reality to each other, the only way that we can agree on what is true versus what's like crazy is social consensus. It used to be that the social consensus was that, is that my Mac? It's hard to tell. They all start with that mountain. So it used to be that the social consensus was that you'd put like a pixelated star field as your screensaver, but now the social consensus is that that is what a laptop screen looks like, is a mountain in the background. Yeah, or like the idea like more concretely that like a kind of it used to be accepted as fact, as truth, that, like a sovereign deity was interfering in all of the like day-to-day activities in which we engage. Like fact, not speculative or not like spiritual, but fact. And now we might say that that's no longer social consensus. Some people still believe this. Other people believe that, it's just a series of like random interactions and that we can measure the outcome of those interactions, and that's pretty much all we got. Okay, cool. So, truth is social consensus. And this gets tricky. Oh, I want to slow down because the next slide is so good. It's the only good one. Oh, well, okay, whatever. So we only have another 20 minutes, so I can't go that slowly. So, and there is some data science in this. It's not all just me like speculating about the nature of the universe. So the tricky part about relying on social consensus for truth, which is in effect what we do. I mean, and I know that none of us think of ourselves as doing that, but like if you really think about the things that you observed first person and don't just use your social relationships and networks of trust to assume, like it's really vanishingly small. Even the things that some of us can get kind of hoity-toity about, like, well, I won't pick anything because it would probably be offensive to somebody. But like all of the things that I assume are absolutely true, like, politics, religion, all of the normal stuff. Oh, okay, we're getting there. That's the bit about your senses and your brain. That's cool. All right, I'll keep going. So the difficult thing is that outside of some like practical objective things that we interact with in a physical way, there we go. Truth is consensus. That's the old philosopher guy. I told you I wasn't lying. Jürgen Habermas. And actually, in all seriousness, I would recommend his work if you're interested in this topic kind of generally. But it still works. OK, truth is consensus. So this is the idea that like the things that we believe that are kind of in the middle, the things that we all accept, OK, that's the truth. Everything else, the kind of tails of that curve are insanity. But the tricky part is stuff like this. So like, my whole life, I grew up thinking that Luke Skywalker was like on the side of the angels. Like he was a rebel fighting for truth and goodness against an oppressive regime that was trying to control and destroy the galaxy and make us like, all fascists or something, and like neck choke us with the Force. Like absolutely, he's a hero. But another way to think about Luke Skywalker is that his parents were killed, he was radicalized, indoctrinated into a crazy ancient religion, and then he made a terrorist attack and killed 300,000 people. I'm sorry, that was a little bit heavy. I could like feel the room just go like, you son of a bitch. Like I can't watch Star Wars anymore in the same way. So, well, if you see Rogue One, it's going to change your mind anyway. So, all right. So, but this idea is, and so like in my research background, quote unquote, is ironically, given the jokes that I was making earlier, is quantitative social science. But I study a lot of extremism and terrorist organizations that are operating online. And something that comes up if you're interested in terrorism, like academically, is all of them. So it's this idea that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. And I think it's important to point out, and it's actually, if you're studying this kind of thing in an academic context, it's actually important to accept that, like, when we hear about somebody blowing himself up in a crowded shopping mall, we think, like, that guy's a terrorist. Like, he's a lunatic, and he's a murderer. And however, he doesn't see himself that way, just like most people don't see themselves as the bad guy. Like, he's somebody who has no other tactics left at his disposal to help his people fight against an external oppressor. So he really is a martyr for a cause that not only will help his people escape being chained, but that he will ascend based on his actions to some kind of spiritual reward. So there really is like this idea of truth, this idea of shared social consensus starts to break down, even in things that we would expect to be like really easy for us all to agree on. And that leads me to this guy. So his name is Edgar Madison. And if you're not like a DC Beltway type person, you might not have heard the story of Edgar Madison. But he's a dude from North Carolina. He's like 28 years old, cares about his friends and family. He's like a Boy Scout, kind of, seriously, in spite of the photo that I chose for him. He is like a good guy. However, Edgar had been reading campaign news. He was swept up in the campaign like everybody else. He was following the WikiLeaks scandal when WikiLeaks hacked into the, well, somebody hacked into the, Russia, hacked into the, the Democratic National Committee email servers, thanks John Podesta and your no two-factor authentication, and provided those emails to WikiLeaks. And in those emails, John Podesta and Hillary Clinton and others were talking about a place in Washington, D.C. that you may not have heard of called Comet Pizza. Comet Pizza is a pizza place where you can play ping pong in a wealthy neighborhood in Washington, D.C. That's what it is. If you go to Comet Pizza, that's what you'll find. However, based on the fact that it was referenced in these emails, Reddit and kind of 4chan and 8chan and these kind of like, less savory online communities, places where people like the alt-right hang out, started saying like, wait a second, Comet Pizza, CP, cheese pizza, CP. You know what people who engage in child pornography on the dark web use as an emoji for referring to the thing that they're engaging in? They use the cheese pizza emoji. Cheese pizza, CP, child pornography. That's what's happening at Comet Pizza. And of course, that's why it's referenced in these emails that are released by WikiLeaks that the DNC doesn't want you to see. And so, it's ridiculous, right? But it's not. This is what starts to get spread around the internet, and this is the kind of thing that Edgar, that guy with the assault rifle that I showed you, was consuming online. So Edgar leaves his home in North Carolina. He travels to Washington, D.C. with his assault rifle. He walks into Comet Pizza, and he starts firing shots into the air, demanding to see where they're hiding the children that are being subjugated in this like child sex trafficking scandal. Of course, he realizes that that's not happening at Comet Pizza. The police all show up, and Edgar gets arrested. However, it seems like maybe Edgar is nuts, but maybe not. So you have to remember what happens when we engage with information online. This was a big story of the campaign, as I'm sure most of you remember. This kind of gets back to this idea of social consensus and the idea that language shapes reality. Most of us experience reality like this. Most of us get our news from social media. So this idea of a filter bubble is not just like, I have a difficult time talking to my crazy uncle at Thanksgiving. Like, it really means that all of the information that you consume about a particular topic, the way in which a particular story is shaped, is from a single point of view, or a relatively narrow point of view. So I don't want to assume anybody's politics, although given that this is A, Austin, B, half of you are from San Francisco, C, the technology industry, and D, there's a lot of academics in the room, my assumption is that our Facebook feeds looked mostly like this. And if it didn't, it doesn't matter. But let's say that I think a lot of us saw this like, oh, Hillary Clinton, like champion of women's rights, Hillary Clinton breaking that last glass ceiling, Hillary Clinton should have been president, oh, you guys. But that's not what Edgar was seeing. Like, Edgar was seeing a record number of Americans now dislike Hillary Clinton. That wasn't some like crazy right-wing newspaper, that's the Washington Post, right? It's not as if you can only consume information from sources of, from InfoWars. Like, you can find stories about Hillary Clinton that would make it clear that she's not somebody who should be running for president. As a matter of fact, and if you get a little bit further afield from the Washington Post, you start to find websites like The Blaze, and they show up in a lot of conservative Facebook feeds. And The Blaze believes that Hillary Clinton is a criminal, not like a criminal, but is a criminal, like somebody who commits crimes and gets away with it. These are the sorts of websites where they circle stories, or they sort of postulate that perhaps Hillary Clinton was involved, the Clintons were involved in killing some people, or having some people killed who were a threat to their kind of political empire. So if everybody you know, if all the language that you consume about Hillary Clinton, all of the things that shape your reality about who she is and what she's about, make it clear that she is a criminal who's getting away with murder, it's really not that difficult to believe that she would be running a child sex trafficking ring out of a pizza place that was only discussed in secret emails that were cracked open by an organization that that was revealing the truth, the hidden truth behind the scandal of Hillary Clinton. And so now you have a justification, almost like a moral obligation, in fact. If this was going on in plain sight and you don't do anything about it, I mean, come on, what a horrible person you are. So, Edgar. This is not the only place that this happens. Like, Pizzagate was kind of an outstanding example, especially if you have DC friends. It was a really fun thing to laugh about. I mean, nobody got hurt when he fired his gun, so it was like kind of a funny story that was like only a little bit about child sex trafficking. It wasn't really about that at all. So it's okay to laugh. Sorry. All right. There's the line. There it is. Sometimes you get right up next to it, and sometimes you just go right over it. OK. But this isn't the only way that this happens. So this is a guy called Gilad Yotan. I might have mispronounced his name. But he does a lot of interesting work, a lot of interesting network analysis. And he was looking at the way that people were sharing news about the story of a 12-year-old boy who was killed in some incident in kind of the midst of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And on one side, he had instigated aggression. Somebody tried to neutralize his aggression and then immediately took him to the hospital after he was shot. That's one side of the story. The other side was that he was ruthlessly murdered by a bunch of horrible people. And so depending on who you were and what your existing political ideologies were, it was easy to reinforce the idea that either the other side were, well, always that the other side are a bunch of insensitive, horrible murderers. And the reason, and that's what this network graph is showing us, that there are two distinct groups that don't have a lot of communication with one another. So you can live in that information vacuum. You can live in a world where reality is shaped for you from a particular point of view. Another way in which language can shape your reality, if you only get certain sources of information, if the entirety of the language that describes an issue is consistent, is this idea of vaccines and the anti-vax movement. I guess, no offense if you don't believe in vaccinating your children. However, this is, that you can see here, there's even like conservative Twitter that is completely distinct from this vaccine choice movement and this other group of people who are talking about autism. There's a very small number of people who really do believe, because all the information tells them so, that it is a fact that vaccines are perpetrated. Like, they're not something that stops people from dying en masse. They're like actually something invented by the pharmaceutical industry to sell you more drugs, and if your kids get autism, so what? And that looks a lot like terrorism, frankly. So not the anti-vax people. That would be a bridge too far. But it's not like, oh, your kid gave some other people smallpox at Disney World? Terrorist. That's not what I mean. We really are getting into sensitive topics. This is going, OK. So, but this is what a network of terrorists communicating with each other online looks like. A couple of years ago, a friend of mine called J.M. Berger and I did a study, kind of a big study about the way that ISIS operates online, and this is what we found, that all they do is communicate with each other. And so you can sort of see where somebody who used to be just a little bit disaffected with his role in the world starts to consume information that reinforces the singular idea that the only way to salvation for him is to leave wherever he lives, Belgium, France, the US, travel to Syria, participate in a conflict in which he is ridding the world of Western oppressors. OK. Whew. So what did we get to? Terrorism. OK, so Pizzagate at scale. In 5 minutes. Oh my god. OK, so we're just getting to the machine learning part. This is going to be fun. 5. OK, cool. So Pizzagate scaling. You may have heard during the election about these people called the alt-right. They're horrible people. I don't want to get into it. That Aryan-looking fellow on your left is Richard Spencer. He's a Nazi. And Pepe the Frog is a symbol, a hate symbol that was popular with the alt-right. OK. The alt-right posts a bunch of horrible things on social media. I thought to myself, let me collect a bunch of information from social media about the alt-right, model their language, and see if we can measure the distance between the reality that they have and the reality that the rest of us live in. OK? Cool. So I looked at a bunch of conservative Twitter accounts. The right loves Trump, conservative, America. The alt-right, white nationalism. And so it was easy to distinguish between kind of white supremacist alt-right accounts versus kind of regular old conservative Twitter users. And there's a bunch of Twitter profile pictures that I found that had swastikas in them for fun at the bottom. OK, so the alt-right is like Pizzagate guy, right? They're crazy. They're lunatics. They're the fringe. They're not like the rest of us. And really, they're not. But we're going to get into why it's important to understand and monitor what they're doing. So the idea is to measure this extreme break from social consensus, measure the difference in their reality and ours. And the way that we do that is word vectors. Now it all comes back. That was 20 minutes. I was expecting more like 15. We got a little bit into the philosophy. OK, so word vectors. The way that word vectors work, if you don't already understand how they work, you're not going to figure this out in the next like 60 seconds. I'm sorry. But the idea is that this model learns what a word means based on its context. So the king walks down the street, the man seems to enjoy golf, the woman blah, blah, blah. You look at the words immediately, you kind of move through sentences, move through documents, scanning different windows of the sentence, and you start to learn the way in which words appear, right? Okay. And if you can do this, you can derive properties about the word. In reality, the properties don't have names like royalty, masculinity, femininity, but it's easier for the explanation. So that means that if you ended up deriving a royalty property looking at the different words that you found in some corpus, it might be that the royalty property for king and queen would be quite high. The masculinity property for king and man might be quite high. And you keep learning these properties and fine-tuning these properties until you can plot in like 100-dimensional space or 300-dimensional space or whatever all of the words in your corpus distinctly. And so you end up with these word vectors. And so you plot these word vectors, and the cool thing, the implication of this, is that words that have similar meanings appear in a similar part of your space, your whatever. So, and if you start measuring the cosine similarity of words, that's why they end up being plotted in the same location. If the cosine distance is far away, if you have big cosine distance, words probably have no relationship with one another, but they're probably used in a similar context so that there's a high cosine similarity, as in they get plotted in the same part of your space. Okay, so this is going to be hard to read because this is a little bit small, but what I did was there's a Google News corpus, like hundreds of millions of documents, billions of words, all from Google News. So, there's a lot of bias in the way that news is reported on one side and the other, but ultimately the language that most journalism publications use is fairly objective. The structure of it is fairly consistent. So if we look at the way that the word Jewish is used and find the words that appear in a similar context, so words that effectively have a similar definition to the word Jewish in mainstream language, we get Muslim, Arab, Christian, right? So like most people, when using the word Jewish, are describing somebody's religion in mainstream language. Awesome. If, for example, you had a bunch of content from the far right, alt-right, neo-Nazi Twitter, like I did, and you looked at and you built a word-to-vec model, and you looked at the words that had the highest cosine similarity, so the top 10 most similar words or whatever, you start to get an idea that the alt-right uses the word Jewish differently than everybody else, which is not a surprise because they're Nazis. So alt-right people use the word Jewish in a similar way to Zionist, communist, homosexual, leftist, anti-white, something, something, liberal, and satanic, right? Like literally, they use the word Jewish as an epithet because they don't like being homosexual either, they don't like being liberal either, they definitely wouldn't want to be communist, and so they use the word Jewish as an epithet. So there's a clear distinction that we can make between the way that these two communities use this word that's very relevant to a domain. And that matters because you can measure the difference, you can measure the distance between this similarity word vector or whatever. So if I get the top n most similar words, highest cosine similarity for the word Jewish in one model, and I compare that to the top n most cosine similar words in another model, and I measure the average cosine distance between all of the words in both vectors, this is kind of like saying what's the difference between the context, right? So what's the difference between the definition? And because we're using a word that's representative of the point of view of this community, we're kind of saying what's the difference, what's the measurement between your reality, alt-right Nazis, and the difference between my reality, totally normal, respectable guy. Oh yeah, and then I put it up on a big slide, but we don't have time for this. No time for drama. Okay, so because I wanted to be able to reference this, I wanted to be able to reference this throughout the rest of the presentation, which I'll move through quickly. I called it the Nazi reality score, and I included that Pepe the Frog giving me the finger because when I published this research in the Washington Post, that was how the internet responded, more or less. So. The cool thing that you can do in this context is measure the distance between different pockets of the conservative Twitter or conservative Twitter in general, and what's their distance from the alt-right over time. So now that we know what it looks like when Nazis use the word Jewish, can we say build a word-to-vec model for every month over some period of time and say month by month by month, is there increasing distance between the reality of conservative Twitter and the reality of the alt-right, or is it the same? Do they talk about Jewish people in the same way? And what you can see is that what I say, the Nazi similarity score between conservative Twitter and the alt-right goes up over time considerably, especially as the elections started to kick into high gear in the late spring. Okay, so can the alt-right change reality? I don't know. We don't really have any time to figure it out. Okay, so this is why this is important. Not just because the alt-right are racists, we know that, but there's not that many of them. However, they pose a larger problem than it might at first appear. So this is Breitbart News. Those are two Breitbart reporters and former D-list MySpace celebrity Tila Tequila doing the Heil Hitler Nazi salute at a party that Richard Spencer's think tank in DC threw after Trump won the election. Weird. Okay, so that's Steve Bannon. He's the chief strategist to Donald Trump. He's in the cabinet. He literally works in the White House now. Well, he's about to. And he is the former chief editor-in-chief of Breitbart, and he called it the platform for the alt-right. He was also Trump's campaign CEO, which is interesting. So now we know that the guy who's really into Breitbart, the platform of the alt-right, a bunch of Nazis, has a lot of influence in the communication strategy of one presidential campaign. Okay, so what I did, I went and got 8 million-ish tweets from 1.7-ish million users from Donald Trump's Facebook page, collected over the course of like the year, from January up through November. And I built some word defect models to see what the distance was between the way that that community used the word Jewish, like what their Nazi similarity score was. And interestingly, before I did that, I discovered that it used to be that conservative people, Republican people, were sort of attached ideologically to Fox News, right? That was kind of like the mouthpiece of conservatives. And interestingly, that is not the case anymore. The domain or the publication most shared at a much higher rate was Breitbart. Breitbart, the platform of the alt-right. Weird. I guess not weird, given the fact that Steve Bannon was the chief strategist for the campaign. Okay, and if you look at the way that that community of Trump supporters, if you look at those 8 million tweets, you break them down month by month by month, you build a word defect model every month, and you measure the Nazi similarity score, the average cosine distance between the words and their blah, 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 blah. It turns out that the main, like, I don't know if it's reasonable to call it mainstream conservative, but like the people who sided with one of the two major presidential candidates started out not talking like the alt-right, because just because you're a Trump supporter doesn't mean you're a racist. I mean, seriously, that's a big part of the country. I mean, we could debate that, but I'm not here to debate that. What I'm saying is like, the kind of racism that I'm talking about is that most people who voted for Trump don't self-identify as Nazis or Nazi sympathizers. So they're not really talking about the word, they're not using the word Jewish in the same way as the alt-right. However, the way that they use that word Jewish has changed over time. Over the course of that year, it was measurably more similar to the alt-right while they were, by the way, sharing a bunch of Breitbart articles. So this is why it matters. It's almost as if reality has shifted in a dotted line that you can't really see. But anyway, the social consensus in this group, the way that they describe reality, so in fact, their reality has changed. That's the idea. However, we don't have time for the hope part. I forgot that this ended on a high note. All right, we'll do it fast. So basically, if you look at so I looked at a bunch of comments from on Hillary Clinton's Facebook page that were comments in support of her. So that was a separate problem, figuring out which comments were in support of her, which comments were trolls. But I did that, I think. And then looked at the way that they talked about different hot topic issues. So if you look at hot topic political issues like the word abortion, the way that Clinton supporters talked about it was the way that you'd expect. Like reproductive women, LGBTQ, healthcare, like they talk about it like a women's health issue. Whereas if you look at the way that the word abortion is used by Trump supporters, or conservative folks, they talk about it in the same way as TPP, gays, marriage, which is gay marriage, terrorism, Obama, ISIS. So like, there's no value judgment here. I think they talk about it like one of those issues that we feel passionately about and usually talk about in a negative way. Like abortion is bad, just like Obama is bad, just like ISIS is bad, right? And I'm not here to debate whether or not that's true, but I think this is like a reasonable representation. I think what it shows is that it accurately captures the way that this particular community sees this issue. The nice thing, though, is that if you look at the most and least polarized words, the words that had the largest distance in the context in which they were used, and the words that actually we use in a really similar way, words like gun, taxes, the media, we talk about those really differently if you're conservative versus whether you're liberal, or if you're a Trump supporter versus a Clinton supporter. But if you look at the words like work, family, people, even government, like we talk about those things in a really similar way. So it's kind of like, if you get away from like abstract issues, I mean, not that abortion is an important debate, but like if you kind of get away from hot topic political issues and you start measuring the distance in the way that we use language to describe everyday things, like, you know, our jobs, we all love our kids, we all love our families, we all go to work, right? Like these normal everyday things that actually impact our lives, we actually don't have a perspective that's that different. Our realities are really similar. So the everyday reality that we experience is the same, even if the reality that we invent for ourselves on social media is really different and getting worse and manipulatable by Nazis. So, okay. Thank you, everybody, for dealing with that condensed version of the presentation. I appreciate it. Here's a bunch of stuff. I work with a company called New Knowledge. We're hiring. We do applied machine learning. It's super awesome. You should come do it. Partially Derivative is a podcast. We're out by the entrance. You can come talk to us. It's a lot of fun. A lot of people listen to it. I hear it's very good. Data for Democracy is a volunteer collective. We're basically finding people who have skills like ours to plug into projects that are meaningful. If that's something that you want to do, you should go do that. And then there's me on the internet. So thank you, everybody, for coming. It's been good.